The cry without a voice. It is with no small hesitation that I set pen to paper in recounting the events which I have entitled The Case of the Music Box That Screamed, for among all the singular adventures it has been my privilege to share with my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, none has lingered so persistently in my mind, nor returned so often to trouble my dreams in the small hours before dawn. I have witnessed many strange phenomena in his company, men who vanished like vapors, crimes contrived with infernal ingenuity, and secrets buried so deeply that only his extraordinary intellect could exhume them. Yet never before, nor since, have I encountered a mystery in which the very laws of sense and reason seemed, at first glance, to recoil in dismay. The affair began upon a bleak November morning of such penetrating chill that even the fire in our Baker Street sitting room struggled to assert its authority. A low fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, dulling the daylight to a sickly yellow hue, while the distant rumble of carriage wheels came softened and distorted, as though London itself were submerged beneath some murky tide. Holmes sat cross-legged in his armchair, clad in his dressing gown of faded purple, his long fingers pressed together and his eyes half closed. To the casual observer he might have appeared idle. To me, who knew him well, he presented the unmistakable aspect of a mind at work. Upon the table beside him lay a disorderly arrangement of chemical apparatus, monographs, and scraps of foolscap covered in his rapid angular hand. For my own part, I had been engaged in sorting my medical notes when a sound from the street below caused me to glance toward the window. A carriage had stopped before the door. There was nothing remarkable in that, for our lodgings were no strangers to visitors, yet something in the abruptness of its arrival caught my attention. I rose and drew aside the curtain. The vehicle was not a hansom, but a private brougham of dark paint and polished fittings. The horse steamed faintly in the cold air. A liveried driver sat rigid upon the box, his posture stiff as carved oak. Before I could remark upon this to Holmes, the bell rang. He did not open his eyes. "Single passenger," said he. I turned. "You heard the carriage?" He replied languidly. "I heard one set of footsteps alight, hesitant, weighted toward the heels, the gait of a man carrying anxiety rather than luggage. Pray admit him, Watson." I confess that though long accustomed to such displays, I felt once again that mingled admiration and irritation which his effortless deductions invariably inspired. I went out and opened the door. The gentleman upon the step was perhaps 35 years of age, though the pallor of his face and the strain in his eyes lent him an older aspect. He was well dressed, impeccably so, but his cravat sat askew, and one glove was buttoned while the other hung loose, trifles which spoke eloquently of a mind too preoccupied for appearances. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. "He is within." He entered with a quick, almost furtive motion, as though pursued by invisible thoughts. I led him to the sitting room. Holmes rose and inclined his head slightly. "You have come about the sound," he said. The effect upon our visitor was extraordinary. He stopped dead. How could you possibly—" Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Pray sit down. You will find it easier to speak when seated. Watson, be so good as to pour our client a measure of brandy. He has not slept." The man sank into the chair as though his legs would no longer support him. I placed the glass in his hand. He drank it at once, then pressed his fingers to his temples. "My name," he said at last, "is Adrian Calder, and I swear to you, gentlemen, that if what I have heard these past 3 nights has any natural explanation, I shall thank Heaven for it on my knees." Holmes resumed his seat. "3 nights," he said softly. "Always at the same hour?" The man stared. "Yes. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning." The man's lips parted. "You know it already?" Holmes steepled his fingers. "No, but I know habits. Continue." What followed was delivered in a voice that trembled despite the speaker's evident effort to control it. Mr. Calder resided, it seemed, in a house near Russell Square, inherited from an uncle who had died abroad some months earlier. The property had stood empty until Calder took possession. The first 2 nights passed without incident. On the third, he was awakened precisely at 2 minutes past 2 by a sound in his bedchamber. Not a knock, not a cry, not, as he first supposed, a dream, but a scream. Here the hand tightened upon the arm of his chair. It was not loud, he said. That is what made it worse. It was contained, as though something wished to scream, but could not. I felt an involuntary shiver. Holmes' expression did not change. You searched the house. Immediately. There was no one, every door locked, every window fastened. I examined each room. Nothing. And the second night? The same, at the same minute, the same sound. And last night? Calder swallowed. Last night, it came from the music box. Holmes' eyelids flickered. The music box? Yes, a small one. German, I believe. It belonged to my uncle. It sits on the mantel in my bedroom. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You are certain the sound issued from it? I am certain. What did you do? I opened it. And? There was no mechanism turning, no spring wound, no music playing, only silence. Holmes' fingers pressed together more tightly. And yet, he said, you heard the scream. Calder's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes. For several moments, Holmes said nothing. The fog outside seemed to thicken, muting the daylight still further, until the room seemed suspended in a dim yellow gloom. At last, Holmes rose. Watson, we shall require our coats. You mean to visit the house? At once. He turned to Calder. You have brought the key. Yes. Excellent. Then we shall examine this musical instrument, which possesses both lungs and motive. Calder rose shakily. You believe me, then? Holmes' eyes gleamed. My dear sir, I believe nothing, but I observe everything, and I confess that a screaming music box is a phenomenon too rare to be neglected. He took his hat from the peg. Come, the sooner we listen, the sooner we may learn who or what is trying so very hard to be heard. And with that, we descended to the waiting carriage, little suspecting that before that same clock struck 2 again, we should stand face to face with a terror far more dreadful than any sound it could produce.
The house in Russell Square. I have observed in the course of my long association with Sherlock Holmes that when a problem presents itself which lies upon the borderland between the explicable and the grotesque, his spirits invariably rise. Where another man might feel unease, he felt stimulation. Where another might shrink, he advanced. It was therefore with a certain grim amusement that I noted the lightness of his step as we entered the waiting carriage, while our client, Mr. Calder, sank into his seat with the air of a man proceeding toward his own arraignment. I, Dr. Watson, seated opposite them, could not rid myself of the peculiar impression that we were bound not merely for a house, but for an explanation which would test even Holmes' celebrated composure. The carriage rolled through the mist-laden streets until the lamps grew fewer and the facades more stately. At length we turned into Russell Square, where the bare trees stood like skeleton sentinels about the iron railings, their branches motionless in the cold morning air. Calder's residence occupied the corner, a tall, narrow house of dark brick, with a flight of stone steps ascending to a black-painted door. Even before we alighted, I sensed a curious stillness about it, as though the building listened. Holmes observed it with keen interest. "A property of late Georgian construction," said he, "refronted in the 40s, windows original, door replaced within 5 years, brass recently polished. Your servant is conscientious, Mr. Calder." "I have no servant," our client replied hoarsely. Holmes's brows rose slightly, but he made no comment. The key turned with a reluctant scrape, and we entered a narrow hall faintly scented with dust and varnish. The air within was colder than the street and carried that unmistakable odor of long-closed rooms, a smell compounded equally of neglect and memory. Calder shut the door behind us with unnecessary haste. "You perceive," said he, "there is no one here." Holmes did not answer. He was listening. It was a faculty of his which I had often admired yet never imitated, the ability to devote his entire consciousness to a single sense. He stood motionless, head slightly inclined, eyes half closed. I too strained my ears, but detected nothing save the distant tick of a clock somewhere in the upper floors. At last Holmes opened his eyes. "Yes," said he, "no one." Calder exhaled sharply, as though he had been holding his breath for minutes. "This way," he said, and led us upstairs. The bedroom lay upon the first floor, overlooking the square. It was a spacious chamber, sparsely furnished, with high ceilings crossed by ornamental plasterwork. A small fire had been lit in the grate, though it struggled, as ours had done, against the damp chill. And there, upon the mantelpiece, between two tarnished candlesticks, stood the object of our visit. It was indeed a music box, no larger than a cigar case, made of dark wood inlaid with delicate silver tracery. Even at a distance I could see that it was exquisitely wrought. The lid bore a tiny enamel scene of alpine mountains beneath a pale blue sky. Holmes approached it slowly. "So," said he, "this is our vocalist." Calder's voice quavered. "Do not open it." Holmes glanced back. "You object?" I would rather not hear it again." "My dear sir," said Holmes gently, "if it screams, it shall do so for science." Without waiting further, he lifted the box from the mantelpiece and held it to the light. His long fingers turned it over, examining every surface. No visible tampering, no wire, no vent, hinges intact, lock absent. Curious. He pressed the catch. The lid sprang open. I confess I started, not because of any sound, but because of the silence. Inside lay the delicate brass cylinder and comb of a perfectly ordinary musical mechanism. No hidden compartments were visible, no additional apparatus presented itself. Holmes bent closer, his eyes glittering. "You say you heard it at 2 minutes past 2. Yes. Each night? Yes." Holmes wound the key. The mechanism began to turn, and a thin, tinkling melody issued forth. Light, mechanical, utterly harmless. It was the sort of tune one might expect to accompany a child's nursery toy. Holmes listened attentively until the last note died. Then he shut the lid. "Nothing," said he softly. Calder's hands trembled. "It never does it when one watches." Holmes nodded. "Naturally." I stared at him. "Naturally?" "My dear Watson, phenomena which occur only in the absence of observers are rarely supernatural. They are merely selective." Holmes replaced the box on the mantel and began a slow circuit of the room. He examined the carpet, the bedstead, the window latches, the fireplace, even the ceiling moldings. At length he crouched near the hearthrug and ran his finger lightly across the floorboards. "Dust disturbed," he murmured. Calder leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Holmes, "that something has been moved recently." "I have moved nothing." "I did not say you had." He rose and crossed to the door. There he inspected the lock with minute attention, producing from his pocket a small lens. "Ah," said he, "what is it?" "A scratch, very faint, quite fresh." "You think someone entered?" Holmes straightened. "My dear Watson, someone has been here repeatedly." Calder uttered a strangled sound. "Impossible! The door is locked each night." Holmes slipped the lens away. Locks, he said, are merely suggestions to an experienced visitor. A sudden tension entered the room. "You mean," said Calder slowly, "that someone has been coming into this house while I slept?" Holmes' tone was matter-of-fact. "I mean that someone has both entered and departed without your knowledge." "But why?" Holmes gestured toward the mantel. "For that." We all looked at the music box. At that instant, a sound broke the stillness. A faint metallic click. It came from the box. Calder recoiled. Holmes's eyes flashed. The lid trembled. Then it opened. Not by Holmes's hand, not by any visible mechanism, but slowly, deliberately, as though lifted by an invisible finger. We three stood frozen. The cylinder within began to turn. No melody came, only a sound. I struggle even now to describe it faithfully. It was not loud, it was not shrill, it was not in the ordinary sense human, yet it possessed unmistakably the dreadful character of a scream suppressed, a thin, strangled cry of something attempting to force sound through a throat that could not produce it. The noise lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then it ceased. The cylinder stopped, the lid snapped shut, silence returned. Calder had sunk against the wall, his face the color of parchment. "Well," said Holmes quietly, "that is decidedly interesting." I found my voice with difficulty. "Holmes, you saw?" "Holmes," said he, "I saw a mechanism obeying instructions. But no one touched it." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the box. "No one visible, Watson." He stepped closer. "And now," he murmured, "we begin." He reached out his hand, and the music box screamed again.
The mechanism of terror. If there are moments in a man's life when reason falters and the mind, for all its training, recoils like a frightened animal, that instant in the chamber at Russell Square stands foremost among mine. I had faced gunfire, riot, and battlefield carnage without losing command of myself, yet the sound that issued from that small, lacquered box chilled me more thoroughly than any cannon's roar. It was not its volume, nor its duration, but its intent, for intent there seemed that froze the blood within my veins. The lid had scarcely snapped shut before Sherlock Holmes stepped forward with an eagerness that bordered upon delight. "Beautiful," said he softly. "Beautiful," cried Calder hoarsely. "You call that beautiful?" Holmes raised a placating hand. "My dear sir, I speak not of its sentiment, but of its construction. Terror, when engineered with precision, is among the finest evidences of intellect." I could not help but interject. "Holmes, you do not mean to imply—" "I mean," said he calmly, "that we are in the presence of design." He bent over the mantel and, with exquisite caution, lifted the box once more. This time he did not open it. Instead, he held it near his ear, turning it slowly, his long fingers poised with the delicacy of a surgeon examining a living organ. Calder watched as though hypnotized. "You are not afraid?" he whispered. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Mr. Calder, fear is merely ignorance awaiting instruction." For nearly a full minute he listened in silence. I observed the faint contraction of his eyelids, the slight tightening of his lips, signs I had long since learned to interpret as the visible indicators of intense mental calculation. At last he spoke. "There is a secondary chamber." "Inside it?" I asked. "Yes, extremely small, concealed within the base." Calder stared. "But you opened it. You saw nothing." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, which proves that whoever constructed it possessed both ingenuity and patience. The compartment is not meant to be discovered by casual inspection." He set the box down again and crouched so that his eyes were level with the mantel. "Watson, your pocket-knife, if you please." I handed it to him. With the blade, he gently probed the underside of the box, tracing the seams of the wood. For several seconds nothing occurred, then he paused. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer. He pressed the tip of the blade into a minute depression scarcely visible to the naked eye. There came a faint click. A narrow panel slid aside from the base, so neatly fitted that until that instant I should have sworn the wood was solid. Calder uttered a gasp. Within the cavity lay a tiny metal cylinder, no larger than a thimble. Holmes extracted it carefully and held it up between finger and thumb. "Observe," said he. I leaned closer. The cylinder was pierced with an intricate pattern of holes, arranged in irregular clusters. At once I recognized its general principle. "It resembles the barrel of a mechanical organ," I said. "Just so, but of a far more specialized variety." Holmes turned it slowly in the light. "This, Watson, is not part of the original instrument. It has been added." "To produce the sound?" "To produce that sound." Calder wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "Then it is a trick," he murmured weakly. "A contrivance, a device." Holmes glanced at him. "Yes." The relief which swept over our clients' faces was almost painful to behold. "Thank God," he murmured. I feared, that it was supernatural." Holmes' tone held the faintest trace of amusement. "My dear sir, nothing is so overrated as the supernatural. It is merely the natural which we have not yet understood." He replaced the cylinder gently on the table. "But do not congratulate yourself too soon. The existence of mechanism does not diminish the seriousness of the matter. On the contrary, it increases it." Calder blinked. "Increases it?" "Certainly. A ghost may be ignored. A machine implies a machinist." I confess that this simple remark struck me with considerable force. The room, which a moment before had seemed merely eerie, now took on a more sinister aspect. For if this thing were designed, then someone designed it. If someone designed it, then someone placed it. And if someone placed it— "He has been here," I said slowly. Inclined his head. Repeatedly. Calder's voice faltered. "But why should anyone wish to frighten me?" Holmes gave a short, thoughtful hum. "That," he said, "is the correct question. Fear is rarely an end in itself. It is a tool." "To force me to leave the house?" "Possibly." "To drive me mad?" "Unlikely. Madness is unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of method." He rose and began pacing the length of the room. "No," he continued, "this contrivance intends something precise, something measurable, something—" He stopped abruptly. "Timed." He turned sharply to Calder. "You say the sound occurred at 2 minutes past 2?" "Yes." "Each night?" "Yes." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "And you have done nothing at that hour save listen?" I hardly dared move." Holmes nodded slowly. "Exactly." I felt a thrill of comprehension. "You think," I said, "that the sound is meant to ensure he remains still?" Holmes pointed at me with approval. "Admirable, Watson, admirable. Our unknown engineer wishes Mr. Calder motionless at a particular moment each night." "But why?" Calder whispered. Holmes's gaze drifted towards the window. "To allow something else to occur undisturbed." We all followed his glance. The square lay silent beyond the glass, its iron railings black against the pallid fog. Holmes crossed to the window and examined the latch. Then he measured the distance from the window to the mantel with rapid strides. 21 feet, he murmured. "Yes, quite feasible." "What is?" I asked. Holmes turned. "A line of sight." He gestured from the window to the mantel. "If a person stood outside with an optical instrument, say a small telescope, he could observe this very spot while remaining concealed among the trees." Calder shuddered. "You mean someone has been watching me?" Holmes's expression was grave.
I mean, someone has been observing this room with extreme interest. The implications settled upon us like falling ash. But what interest could there be in this box? I demanded. Holmes tapped the hidden cylinder. Not the box, this. You think it contains information? I am certain of it. Then the sound is merely a signal. Calder's lips trembled. A signal? To whom? Holmes's voice dropped. To someone who is listening for it. At that moment, a dull sound came from below. Footsteps, slow, measured, not upon the pavement outside, but inside the house. Calder's eyes widened in terror. You hear it? Holmes did not move, his head tilted slightly, like that of a hound catching a distant scent. Yes, he said quietly, I hear it. The steps creaked upon the staircase. 1, 2, 3. Each tread spoke with dreadful clarity in the silence. Calder seized my arm. You locked the door, he whispered. I locked it myself. The footsteps continued upward. Holmes's face had grown very still. Watson, said he calmly, be so good as to stand a little to the right of the doorway. I obeyed without question. The steps reached the landing, stopped, silence. Then a shadow fell across the gap beneath the bedroom door. Someone stood outside, waiting.
The man beyond the door. There are certain silences which seem not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something waiting, listening, measuring. The hush that filled Mr. Calder's bedchamber at that instant was of such a nature. The faint fog light from the window lay pale upon the carpet, the fire gave a soft, intermittent tick, and beneath the door, clear as ink upon parchment, stretched the narrow shadow of a man. No one spoke. I stood where Holmes had directed me, a pace to the right of the doorframe, my heart beating with an energy that seemed loud enough to betray us all. Calder, pressed against the wall, had clasped both hands over his mouth as though to imprison any sound which terror might force from him. Beside the mantel, Sherlock Holmes had not altered his posture by so much as an inch. His gaze remained fixed upon the panel of the door, his expression composed, attentive, almost courteous, like that of a host awaiting the entrance of a guest whose punctuality he admired. The shadow shifted. A faint movement. Then came 3 knocks. Not loud, not hurried. Measured. Each rap fell with the deliberate precision of a metronome. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Come in," said he. The latch turned. The door opened slowly. A man stood upon the threshold. He was of middle height, sparely built, and dressed with the sober neatness of a clerk or tutor. His coat was brushed, his boots polished, his gloves immaculate. His face, though not handsome, possessed that peculiar regularity which makes a countenance difficult to remember, yet it was not the features which held my attention. The eyes. They were pale gray and singularly steady, like chips of frosted glass. He looked first at Holmes, then at me, then at Calder, and smiled. "I fear," said he, in a soft, cultivated voice, "that I intrude." Holmes returned the smile with equal courtesy. "On the contrary, you arrive most opportunely." Calder made a strangled sound. "You!" The newcomer raised one gloved finger gently. "Pray do not distress yourself, Mr. Calder. I assure you I come in the friendliest spirit." His composure was extraordinary, not the forced calm of a man suppressing agitation, but the natural ease of one whose mind moves always on rails of certainty. Holmes gestured toward the center of the room. "Be so good as to step inside," he said. "You will find the air warmer away from the landing." The man complied without hesitation and closed the door behind him. "I see," he remarked, glancing toward the mantel, "that you have discovered the addition."
Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. Indeed, and a most ingenious addition it is. I am gratified that it meets with your approval. The stranger removed his gloves with deliberate care and slipped them into his pocket. His gaze rested briefly upon the small metal cylinder lying upon the table. I trust you did not find it difficult to locate. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. Not excessively. Excellent. I confess that the man's tone remained mild. There was in his manner something so assured, so perfectly untroubled, that it produced in me a sensation bordering upon unease. It was not arrogance, it was not insolence, it was something colder, the quiet confidence of one who has already calculated every outcome. Calder's voice quavered. "You! Who are you?" The visitor inclined his head slightly. "A student of patterns." Holmes's smile deepened. "Yes," he said softly, "I thought so much." The man's eyes brightened faintly, as though he had been paid a compliment. "You are observant." "I try." A pause followed. Then Holmes added, "You have been entering this house for several nights." "Yes." "You have been entering it by means of a duplicate key." "Yes." "To observe Mr. Calder's behavior." "Yes." The man folded his hands lightly before him. "You see," he said, "how much time we save by dispensing with pretense." Calder stared from one to the other like a spectator at a match whose rules he did not understand. "You admit it? You admit you have been coming here?" "Certainly." "But why?" The visitor regarded him with mild surprise. "My dear sir, because your house contains something of value." Calder swallowed. "The music box?" The man's lips curved faintly. "No." He turned his pale gaze back to Holmes. "You have it, I believe." Holmes did not answer. The silence stretched. At last the stranger said gently, "Come, Mr. Holmes, you have already demonstrated both perception and dexterity. Surely you will not now pretend ignorance." Holmes inclined his head. "Very well. Let us say that I possess an object which once resided here. What then?" "Then," said the man pleasantly, "we must discuss terms." The word hung in the air like a thin blade. "Terms?" I repeated involuntarily. He turned his eyes upon me for the first time. "And you are?" "Dr. Watson," I said. "Ah," he nodded politely, "the chronicler." His gaze returned to Holmes. "Yes, terms. I am prepared to offer a sum of money in exchange for the article." Holmes's tone was light. "I assume I wish to sell." "I assume," said the man, "that all men wish to sell, if the price is correct." "And if it is not?" The stranger's smile did not alter. "Then other arrangements become necessary." Calder shivered visibly. Holmes studied the man for a long moment. "You are remarkably frank." "I find frankness economical." "Yes," Holmes murmured, "so do I." The fog outside pressed thick against the window panes. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. Holmes took a slow step toward the table where the cylinder lay. "You devised this little instrument to produce a sound which would ensure our client remained motionless at a particular hour." "Yes." "To conduct observations from the square." "Yes." "And those observations concerned the location of the object you seek." The man's eyes glinted. "You are very near the truth." Holmes's fingers hovered above the cylinder, but did not touch it. "I wonder," he said softly, "whether you would care to tell us what the object is." The visitor tilted his head. "I would rather you told me where it is." The two men looked at one another. Never, in all my years beside Holmes, had I witnessed a confrontation so utterly devoid of outward hostility, yet so charged with intellectual tension. It was like watching two mathematicians contemplating the same equation from opposite sides of the blackboard. At length, Holmes said, "You are confident. I am precise. You believe you can obtain it from me. I am certain of it." Holmes's eyes shone. "How refreshing," he said. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Holmes clasped his hands lightly behind his back. "You have an advantage. You know my name. I do not know yours." The visitor considered. "That," he said, "is easily remedied." He inclined his head with the faintest bow. "My name is Graymont." Calder gasped. I felt a tightening in my chest, for though the name conveyed nothing to me at the time, it was clear from Holmes's expression that it conveyed a very great deal to him. Holmes's smile grew thin. "Professor Graymont," he said. The visitor's eyes flashed once, quickly, sharply, like steel catching light. "I see," he murmured, "that my reputation has not entirely evaporated." "On the contrary," Holmes quietly said, "it has merely condensed." The stillness that followed was profound. Then Holmes spoke again. "You have come to take something from me." "Yes, and if I refuse—" Graymont regarded him with calm interest. "Then," he said, "I shall take something else." Calder uttered a faint cry. Holmes did not move. "What," he asked, "might that be?" The professor's pale eyes shifted, past Holmes, past me, and settled upon the mantelpiece. "Your time." At that instant, from somewhere deep within the house below us, there sounded a heavy metallic crash.
The melody beneath the floorboards. The silence that followed Holmes's declaration was not empty. It was crowded, thick with dread, memory, and the lingering echo of that impossible scream. Inspector Lestrade stared at the music box as though it might leap from the table and bite him. "You cannot mean," he said slowly, "that the thing contains—" "A voice," Holmes finished calmly. "Yes, not merely recorded sound, something far more deliberate." I felt a chill creep along my spine. "Holmes, you're suggesting that someone constructed this device not simply to frighten, but to preserve a cry." Holmes's thin smile did not reach his eyes. "My dear Watson, I am suggesting something far worse, that the cry was meant to be heard again." The music box lay between us, harmless in appearance, its brass filigree glinting softly in the lamplight. No ordinary craftsman could have built it, that much was obvious now. Its construction was too precise, its mechanism too intricate. Even closed, it seemed tense, as if restraining another outburst. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Well, whatever devilry is inside it, we can open it and be done." Holmes raised a finger. "Not yet." "Not yet?" the inspector snapped. "Holmes, the thing nearly stopped my heart last time it played." "Exactly, which is why we must proceed with intelligence rather than enthusiasm." He crouched beside the floorboards where the box had first screamed. With delicate fingers, he tapped the wood in several places, listening intently. Tap, tap, tap. The third tap produced a hollow note. Holmes froze. I leaned closer. "You hear it?" "Oh, yes, and I suspect you shall hear it as well." He produced his pocket knife and carefully slipped its blade into the seam between two planks. With a gentle twist, he pried upward. The board lifted with a faint groan of old nails surrendering their hold. Beneath yawned darkness. Lestrade bent down, holding the lamp low. The golden light spilled into the cavity, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside lay a strip of blackened parchment. Holmes reached in and drew it out with tweezers. The parchment was brittle, its edges charred as if it had survived a fire. Across its surface ran a line of jagged writing in faded ink. I read it aloud before I could stop myself. "Do not let it play twice." Silence fell again. Lestrade swallowed. "Well, that's cheerful." Holmes studied the words, his expression sharpening. "Watson, do you note the ink?" It's uneven, precisely, written in haste, and observe the tremor in the lettering. Fear, not age, caused that hand to shake. You think the writer heard the box? Holmes looked at me gravely. I think the writer heard something worse after it. Before I could question him further, a faint sound reached us. A soft metallic click. All three of us turned slowly toward the table. The music box had opened. No hand had touched it. The lid now stood upright, revealing the tiny brass cylinder within. It had begun to rotate. Holmes moved instantly. "Do not move," he whispered. The cylinder turned once, twice. The melody began, not the gentle tune we had heard earlier, but a distorted lullaby, its notes stretched and warped as though played through a broken throat. The air grew colder. I swear upon my medical honor that the temperature dropped in that room by several degrees in the span of seconds. Lestrade's breath fogged, and then the scream came again, but this time it did not come from the box. It came from beneath the floor. Lestrade shouted and leapt back. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as the sound rose from the hollow beneath us, a muffled human cry, desperate and suffocating. Holmes dropped to his knees and tore up the loosened plank. The cry grew louder. "Good God," I gasped. "There's someone under there." Holmes thrust his arm into the darkness. "Help me!" Lestrade and I seized the board and ripped it free. From the black cavity below emerged a hand, not skeletal, not dead, alive. Weak fingers clawed upward, trembling toward the light. We dragged him out together. He collapsed onto the carpet, coughing violently, his clothes coated in dust and splinters. His face was pale as candle wax, his eyes wild with terror. Holmes shut the music box with a snap. Instantly, the scream stopped. The man's breathing slowed. He clutched Holmes's sleeve with shaking fingers. Don't let it play again." Holmes's voice softened, a tone I had heard him use only with the bravely injured or dying. "It will not," he said. "You are safe now." The man swallowed hard. "No one is safe when it plays." We carried him to the settee and gave him water. He drank greedily, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Lestrade folded his arms. "All right, my friend, start talking. Who are you, and why were you hiding under a floor?" The man's gaze drifted slowly to the table, to the music box. His face turned gray. "I wasn't hiding," he whispered. Holmes leaned forward. "Then why were you there?" The man's lips trembled. "Because," he said, voice barely audible, "because that is where it sends you." I confess that even Holmes appeared momentarily aback. "What sends you?" he asked quietly. The man raised a shaking finger, pointing at the music box. Outside, somewhere in Baker Street, a carriage rattled past. Inside, no one spoke. The lamp flame flickered, and for the first time since I had known Sherlock Holmes, I saw uncertainty in his eyes.
The mechanism of fear. Holmes did not speak for a full half-minute. That alone told me more than any exclamation could have done. He stood perfectly still before the table, eyes fixed upon the music box, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The rescued man lay trembling on the settee, his breath still ragged, while Lestrade shifted uneasily beside the hearth, clearly wishing himself anywhere else in London. At last Holmes said quietly, "Watson, kindly lock the door." I did so at once. "Curtains," he added. Lestrade hurried to draw them shut. The room dimmed, the lamplight now the only illumination. Shadows gathered in the corners like silent witnesses. Holmes turned back to the man.
You will begin at the beginning. The fellow swallowed. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and thin. My name is Edwin March. Holmes nodded once. Go on, Mr. March. I was hired, he whispered, to repair it. He pointed again toward the music box, but could not bear to look directly at it. I'm a watchmaker by trade, precision mechanisms, delicate work. A gentleman came to my shop 3 nights ago carrying that box, said it had belonged to his sister, said it played wrong. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Describe him. March shut his eyes, summoning memory. Tall, thin, beard trimmed very close, gloves even indoors, spoke softly, but not kindly. Lestrade muttered, "That narrows London down to about half its population." Holmes ignored him. Continue. I opened the case, March said. At first I saw nothing unusual. The cylinder, the pins, the comb, perfectly ordinary. But when I wound it, he shuddered violently. It screamed. The words seemed to chill the air again. I thought it must be some trick device, a novelty instrument. I tried to dismantle it, but the screws, his eyes widened, they wouldn't come out, not one of them. It was as though they were welded in place. Holmes leaned slightly forward. And your client? March's voice cracked. He smiled when it screamed. Holmes's gaze flicked briefly to me. I knew that look. It meant a pattern was forming. What happened next? Holmes asked. March's hands trembled in his lap. He told me, he whispered, that I must listen carefully, that the second time would be clearer. Lestrade shifted. Clearer? March nodded slowly. So he wound it again. The room seemed to shrink around us as he spoke, and this time I heard words. Holmes's tone became razor thin. What words? March licked dry lips. A voice, he said, a woman's voice, faint, strangled. She said, he stopped. Holmes's voice dropped to almost nothing. She said, what? March's eyes darted toward the music box. She said, he's under the floor. No one moved. Holmes turned his head very slowly toward the exposed planks beside the table. Lestrade whispered, but that's where we found him. Yes, said Holmes softly, which means the voice was not warning about Mr. March. My stomach tightened. Then who was it warning about? Holmes did not answer. March continued shakily. After it played, the gentleman told me I must keep the box overnight, said I should study it, learn its secret. And you agreed? Lestrade asked. I didn't dare refuse. There was something wrong with him, something hollow. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. A most precise description. Go on. I brought it home, set it on my table. I told myself it was mechanical trickery, hidden reeds, air whistles, something scientific. His breathing quickened, but when midnight came, it opened by itself. I felt my pulse quicken. And it played, I said. He nodded weakly. And after it screamed, I heard footsteps. Inside your house? I asked. No, he whispered. Inside the walls. Lestrade swore under his breath. March clutched his temples. They walked all around me, slow, careful, like someone searching. Then the voice came again, from the box. What did it say? Holmes asked. It said, hide. The room seemed suddenly very still. Holmes's expression had changed. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. So you hid beneath the floor, I said quietly. March nodded. I pried up the boards and climbed in. I don't know why. I just knew I had to. And then his voice faded. I heard breathing above me. Lestrade's eyes widened. Someone came into the room. I don't know, March whispered. I only know I heard breathing, slow, patient, like someone waiting for me to come out. Holmes's gaze shifted again to the music box. And how long were you under there?
"I don't know," March said weakly. "Hours, maybe a day. I was too afraid to move. Every time I thought of climbing out, the box would start playing again." Holmes straightened. Without warning, he reached out and placed his hand on the music box. "Holmes," I snapped. "It is quite all right, Watson. But he said—" "Yes," Holmes said calmly. "He said the box sends people beneath the floor." His long fingers rested lightly on the lid. "And I believe that is precisely what the device was designed to do." Lestrade blinked. "Designed to scare people into hiding?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "No, Inspector. Designed to make them hide so they may be easily found." A silence followed that statement so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. Holmes's thumb slowly lifted the lid latch. Click. March screamed hoarsely, "Don't!" But Holmes had already opened it. The cylinder began to turn. The melody crept out, thin, warped, wrong. We all held our breath. The scream began to rise, and from somewhere behind us came the sound of breathing. Holmes did not turn. Instead, he smiled. "Ah," he murmured softly, "right on schedule."
The man behind the wall. I do not think I have ever known a moment in my life when my senses were so acutely alive as they were in that instant. The music box shrieked its thin metallic cry upon the table. Its dreadful notes seemed to burrow into the nerves rather than the ear. Yet even that infernal sound did not so chill my blood as the slow, measured breathing that came from behind us. Not from the door, not from the hall, from the wall. Lestrade spun round first, his hand already darting for the revolver in his coat. "Who's there?" he barked. No answer came, only breathing. Slow, patient, deliberate. Holmes, meanwhile, had not moved an inch. His long fingers still rested upon the open lid of the music box, as though he were a conductor guiding its ghastly tune. "You are late," he said calmly to the wall. The breathing stopped. I assure you that silence was more dreadful than the sound. Then, a faint scrape. It came from the paneling beside the bookcase. Lestrade leaped forward and seized the edge of the wooden frame. With a violent wrench, he dragged it aside. Behind it was darkness, and in that darkness, eyes. The man stepped out slowly, as though he had been expecting applause. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed with meticulous neatness. His beard was trimmed close along the jaw, and his gloves were still upon his hands, despite the warmth of the room. His expression was composed, almost courteous, yet there was something so profoundly lifeless in his gaze that I felt at once I was looking upon a creature who regarded humanity as an experiment rather than a fellowship. He inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "you are later than most." Lestrade drew his revolver fully. "Stand where you are." The man obeyed at once. Holmes closed the music box. The screams ceased. The sudden silence rang louder than any alarm. "I wondered," Holmes remarked conversationally, "how long it would take you to reveal yourself." The stranger smiled faintly. "I had hoped to observe longer. Your reactions are instructive." "Your name," said Lestrade sharply. The man looked at him as one might regard a clerk requesting a receipt. "Silas Vane." The name seemed to pass through the room without recognition, yet Holmes's eyes brightened at once. "Ah," murmured Holmes. "Of course." "You know him?" I whispered. Holmes nodded slightly. "A mechanician of unusual ingenuity, expelled from 3 societies for ethical disagreements." Vane's smile widened almost imperceptibly. "Ethics," he said, "are the refuge of the unimaginative." Lestrade snapped. "You'll save your philosophy for the magistrate." Holmes gestured lightly toward the music box.
Mr. Vane, you have constructed a most singular device. Vane inclined his head. Thank you. You use it not merely as an instrument of sound, but as an instrument of behavior. Vane's eyes gleamed. Now that is a compliment. Lestrade frowned. What in heaven's name are you two talking about? Holmes spoke without taking his eyes off Vane. The box does not merely produce noise, it produces instruction. I stared. Instruction? Holmes blinked. Phonographic suggestion. A miniature recording diaphragm concealed within the cylinder housing. Ingenious. I suspected as much when I saw the abnormal tension screws. Vane gave a soft clap of gloved fingers. Magnificent. Lestrade stared between them. You mean that thing talks? It does more than talk. It commands. The realization struck me like a physical blow. The voice, I said slowly, it told him to hide. Precisely, Holmes replied. Vane's smile sharpened. Fear opens doors the will keeps shut. Lestrade looked from March to Vane. You frightened him into crawling under his own floorboards. Yes, said Vane pleasantly. Why? Vane's eyes flicked toward the music box. To see whether he would. For a moment, no one spoke. The sheer casualness of the answer was more chilling than any confession of violence could have been. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. You wish to test obedience under auditory suggestion. Exactly. And the hidden passage in the wall, Holmes continued. A precaution. Observation requires proximity. Lestrade's grip tightened on his revolver. You were spying on him in his own house? Certainly. Otherwise, the results would be anecdotal. I felt a sudden surge of indignation. You treated him like a laboratory animal. Vane turned his pale eyes toward me. My dear doctor, all men are laboratory animals. Most simply lack the honesty to admit it. Holmes gave a soft sigh. You see, Watson, what comes of intellect divorced from conscience. Lestrade stepped forward. You'll come with me. Vane did not resist. Instead, he asked mildly, May I bring the box? No, Lestrade snapped. Holmes interjected. On the contrary, Inspector, I recommend you allow it. Lestrade stared. Why? Holmes' eyes glinted. Because, without it, you have no case. Silence fell again. Vane's smile deepened in appreciation. You see, he said softly, he understands. Holmes inclined his head. The device is your method. Without demonstrating it, you cannot be charged with coercion or unlawful confinement. You never touched the victim. You never entered the room. You merely suggested. Lestrade swore under his breath. Vane said lightly, Law is a delightful game, is it not? Holmes' voice cooled a degree. Fortunately, you made one mistake. Vane's eyes sharpened. Did I? Yes. Holmes reached into his pocket and produced a tiny brass screw. You replaced one fastening pin after your last adjustment. This one. Vane's expression did not change, but something in his gaze tightened. Holmes continued softly. You handled it without gloves. Lestrade's face lit. Fingerprints. Vane's stillness hardened. Holmes nodded. You see, Mr. Vane, science is not solely your servant. For the first time, the man's composure faltered by a fraction. Then, slowly, he smiled again. Well played. Lestrade stepped forward and took his arm. You're coming with me. Vane did not resist. As he passed Holmes, he paused. You are the first man, he said quietly, who has ever interested me more than my own work. Holmes inclined his head slightly.
I regret that the sentiment is not mutual. Vane gave a faint approving nod. Then Lestrade let him out. The door closed. The fog outside pressed against the window like a listening crowd. For a long time, neither Holmes nor I spoke. At last, I said quietly, "Holmes, had you known he was there all along?" Holmes seated himself and relit his pipe. "My dear Watson, I was certain of it the moment Mr. March described the breathing. You suspected a hidden observer? Of course, the entire mechanism depends on observation. Without observation, his experiment has no value." "And the music box?" I asked. Holmes exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke. "A weapon," he said, "far subtler than any pistol." I looked at the small object resting on the table. It appeared harmless now, almost pretty, yet I could not shake the feeling that if I listened too closely, I might still hear some faint echo of its dreadful cry. Holmes rose and shut the lid firmly. "I think," he said, "we shall consign this instrument to Scotland Yard's evidence vault." "A wise decision," I agreed. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Yes, Watson, there are some melodies the world is better without."
The experimenter's smile. The events of that extraordinary night did not conclude, as I had expected, with the simple removal of Silas Vane and his infernal device. Indeed, if anything, they seemed only to deepen in complexity once the man himself had been taken away. Holmes did not retire. He did not even sit. Instead, he stood for a long time beside the mantel, pipe unlit between his fingers, his gaze fixed upon nothing visible. I had learned long before that this peculiar stillness signified not rest, but rather the most intense form of mental activity. At last, I said quietly, "You were troubled." Holmes tilted his head faintly. "My dear Watson," he replied, "it would be more accurate to say that I am intrigued." "By Vane?" "By the imperfection of his crime." That answer surprised me. "Imperfection," I repeated, "but you yourself said he made only one mistake." Holmes' thin smile appeared. "Yes," he said, "and that is precisely what troubles me." He crossed to the table and lifted the music box once more. It lay silent now, its lid closed, its polished wood reflecting the lamplight with deceptive innocence. Holmes turned it slowly in his hands. "A mind such as Vane's," he murmured, "does not commit accidental errors. If he left a trace, it was either unavoidable or intentional." "You think he wanted to be caught?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he asked, "Watson, what is the primary weakness of all experimental philosophers?" I considered. "Vanity?" Holmes inclined his head. "Excellent. And what is vanity's favorite indulgence?" "Recognition." "Precisely." He set the box down again. "A man who conducts private experiments upon human fear is not satisfied merely to observe results. He wishes, sooner or later, to exhibit them." I felt a faint unease stir in my chest. "You mean he planned for discovery?" Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "I mean, Watson, that I suspect we have not yet seen the conclusion of Mr. Vane's experiment." The implications settled over me like cold mist. Before I could respond, a sharp rap sounded upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and breathless. "Mr. Holmes, sir, there's a message just come for you. A boy brought it, said it was urgent." Holmes took the folded slip from her hand. The moment he read it, I saw his expression change. Not surprise. Recognition. "Well?" I asked. Holmes passed it silently to me. The note contained only one sentence. "If you wish to see the final result, come at once." No signature, but beneath the words was drawn a small, precise symbol. A circle, divided by a vertical line.
Holmes took up his coat at once. "Come, Watson. You know where this leads? I have an excellent suspicion." He paused only long enough to slip the music box into his pocket. I stared. "You're taking that thing with you?" "Most certainly. But why?" Holmes's eyes flashed with quiet excitement. "Because I believe we are about to attend a demonstration." We were in the street within minutes. The fog had thickened to a yellowish veil, swirling beneath the gas lamps like living breath. A hansom cab was secured, and Holmes directed the driver in a tone so swift and low that I could not catch the address. The journey seemed at once too fast and far too slow. Holmes spoke not a word the entire time. His fingers rested lightly upon his coat pocket, upon the shape of the music box. At last, the cab drew to a halt. We stepped down. Before us rose a narrow building of dark brick, its windows black, its doorway unlit. I peered up. "Where are we?" Holmes's voice came softly. "An abandoned lecture hall." I frowned. "Lecture hall?" "Yes, formerly used for demonstrations of mechanical acoustics." A chill ran through me. The front door stood ajar. Holmes pushed it open. The interior smelled of dust and old varnish. Rows of benches descended towards a small stage. The place had the peculiar silence of rooms long unused, a silence so complete that even breathing seemed an intrusion. At the center of the stage stood a single chair, occupied. A man sat there, perfectly still. We descended together. My boots echoed softly on the wooden steps. The man did not move, not even when we stood before him. Holmes regarded him with calm attention. "Good evening," he said. No reply. I felt a tightening in my throat. "Holmes," I whispered. "He's not." Holmes raised a finger. Silence. Then, the man spoke, but his lips did not move. The voice came from behind him, thin, mechanical, familiar. "Observe." My blood froze. Holmes' gaze flicked past the seated figure. There, mounted on a stand at the rear of the stage, was another music box, larger, more elaborate. Its cylinder was already turning. The man in the chair's eyes were wide, unblinking, terrified. Yet he did not move, could not move. Holmes stepped forward slightly. "A refinement," he murmured. The mechanical voice continued. "Subject displays full motor inhibition under auditory directive." I felt my pulse hammer. "Holmes," I whispered urgently, "we must stop this." But Holmes did not move. His gaze was fixed, not on the victim, but on the shadows above the stage. "Ah," he said softly, "there you are." I followed his eyes upward. At first I saw nothing. Then, a faint outline. A figure crouched among the rafters, watching. Silas Vane smiled down from us. "You see, Mr. Holmes," he said gently, "I could not resist one final observation." My hand clenched involuntarily. Lestrade had taken him, locked him up, and yet here he was. Holmes spoke in a tone of polite curiosity. "You escaped custody." "On the contrary, I was released," Vane replied pleasantly. Holmes' brow lifted slightly. "Indeed." "Yes, your Inspector Lestrade discovered, regrettably, that he possessed no lawful grounds to detain me." Holmes sighed faintly. "Ah, procedure, the Achilles heel of justice." Vane inclined his head. "You anticipated that, I think." "I hoped for it," Holmes corrected. Vane's smile widened. "So you wished this meeting?" "I wished," said Holmes, "to see how far you would go." The man in the chair whimpered faintly, but did not rise. The larger music box shrieked again. The sound filled the hall like tearing metal. Vane spread his hands slightly. "You observe, Mr. Holmes, the perfection of suggestion. No ropes, no chains, only instruction and obedience." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Yes," he said, "very instructive." Then, with perfect calm, Holmes reached into his coat and removed the small music box. Vane's eyes flickered. "For symmetry," Holmes said mildly, and he opened it. 2 screams filled the hall, one high, one low, both mechanical, both terrible. The air itself seemed to vibrate with command. For one suspended instant, nothing moved. Then, Vane's smile vanished, because the man in the chair suddenly stood up.
The reversal. The man who had sat rigid upon the chair rose as though pulled upright by invisible strings. His motion was not natural. It was not voluntary. It was the stiff, mechanical assent of a figure compelled by forces outside his own will. His limbs trembled. His eyes remained wide and glassy, yet he stood. Silas Vane's expression changed for the first time since I had seen him. It was not fear, not yet, but it was the death of certainty. Holmes did not shift his stance. He held the smaller music box open in one hand, its dreadful cry threading through the larger machine's tone, like a second blade of sound cutting across the first. "You see," Holmes remarked conversationally, "suggestion is a delicate science. One must be certain whose voice the subject hears most clearly." Vane's gaze flicked from the standing man to Holmes to the smaller device. "You altered it," he said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "A trifling adjustment while you were admiring your hidden vantage point in Baker Street." Vane's eyes narrowed. "You tampered with my work." "My dear sir, you invited critique." The larger music box shrieked again, its metallic voice issuing another command: "Remain still." The man shuddered, but did not stop moving. Slowly, as though wading through water, he turned toward Holmes instead. Vane's gloved fingers tightened against the beam upon which he crouched. "That is not possible," he said softly. Holmes' tone remained light. "On the contrary, competing stimuli frequently produce cognitive conflict. The stronger directive prevails." Vane's gaze sharpened. "What directive did you give him?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Why, none at all." The man took another step, toward Holmes, toward us. The larger machine shrieked louder, its cylinder spinning with frantic speed. "Stop!" The man did not stop. Vane's composure cracked. "You altered the tonal register," he said sharply. Holmes said nothing. Vane's eyes darted to the small box again. "You changed the harmonic sequence." Still Holmes said nothing. Realization dawned. "You introduced dissonance." Holmes inclined his head. "At last. I confess I understood none of it, but Vane understood, and that was enough." "You disrupted the suggestive frequency," Vane said. "You interfered with the conditioning pattern." Holmes' eyes glinted. "My dear Mr. Vane, I merely introduced a competing instruction." The man walking toward us swayed, his breathing ragged. The great machine screamed again. "Obey!" Holmes spoke softly. "Walk." The man walked. Vane dropped lightly from the rafters. The movement was so sudden that I started. He landed soundlessly on the stage boards and strode to the larger machine, his composure now sharpened into something keen and dangerous. "You presume too much," he said quietly. Holmes watched him with interest. "You built a tool, not a miracle." Vane's hand hovered over the mechanism. "I built certainty." Holmes shook his head gently. "No, sir, you built a hypothesis."
With a swift motion, Vane adjusted a small lever within the larger box. The sound changed. It deepened, thickened. The vibration rolled through the hall like distant thunder. The man approaching us faltered. His steps slowed. His head twitched. Vane smiled again. "Observe," he said. The man stopped. Holmes' gaze brightened. "Excellent," he murmured. Then he spoke very clearly. "Sit." The man did not move. Vane's smile widened. "You see?" Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I see precisely." And then Holmes closed the small music box. Silence snapped into the air like a broken wire. The large machine continued alone. Its tone swelled, dominant, commanding. The man's eyes dulled. His shoulders sagged. Slowly, he began to turn back toward the chair. Vane watched Holmes with quiet triumph. A single voice is always strongest. Holmes slipped the small box calmly back into his coat. "Yes," he agreed, "it usually is." Then Holmes stepped forward, straight toward the large machine, straight toward Vane. I felt my pulse leap. "Holmes!" He did not slow. Vane's eyes sharpened. "I would advise you not to interfere." Holmes continued walking. "Would you?" "Yes." "On what grounds?" Vane's voice softened. "On the grounds that I should dislike harming you." Holmes stopped only inches beneath the machine. He studied it with calm fascination. "How beautifully made! Your finest work, I think." Vane said nothing. Holmes leaned closer. "And yet," his finger tapped lightly against the casing, "fatally flawed." In one swift motion, Holmes lifted the lid. The cylinder spun. The scream surged, then stopped. The mechanism clicked, once, twice, then fell silent. Vane stared, not at Holmes, at the machine. "No," he said. Holmes calmly plucked a tiny shard of metal from the exposed works. "A missing tooth," he said pleasantly. "Your gear was already worn. I merely persuaded it to retire." Vane's voice sharpened. "You broke it." Holmes shook his head. "No, sir, I revealed its weakness." Behind us, the man collapsed into the chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The hall fell utterly silent. No scream, no command, no sound but breathing. For a long moment Vane did not move. Then slowly he smiled, and I felt a coldness run through me greater than before, because it was not the smile of a defeated man. It was the smile of a man who had just learned something new. "Remarkable," he whispered. Holmes watched him steadily. "You are not angry?" I said. Vane looked at me almost kindly. "My dear doctor, how could I be?" His eyes returned to Holmes. "This," he said softly, "is data." "And what conclusion have you drawn?" Holmes' smile widened. "That you, Mr. Holmes, are the only mind in London worth experimenting upon." From somewhere outside the hall came a distant whistle. Police. Lestrade, summoned earlier, no doubt, by Holmes himself. Vane heard it too. He inclined his head slightly. "It seems our session concludes." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Yes," he said, "it does." Vane folded his hands. "I look forward," he said gently, "to our next trial." Holmes' expression did not change. "You will find," he replied, "that I am an unwilling subject." Vane's eyes glinted. "All the better." Footsteps thundered in the corridor beyond. The door burst open. Lestrade and two constables rushed in. They stopped short at the sight of us, and of Vane, standing calmly beside the silent machine, waiting.